today's we're going to wander with St. Francis Xavier, who lived from 1506 to 1552, and his feast day is December 3rd. His travels in the East. It was a ghastly voyage. For one thing, it took them 13 months to sail from Portugal around the southern tip of Africa to India. There was a complete mixture of people on board the small sailing ship: slaves, soldiers, and merchants. Then there was an outbreak of the illness known as scurvy, and Francis had to turn his tiny cabin into a hospital. While he was at sea, he remembered one day 7 years earlier. He was then a student in Paris, where he had met a fellow Spanish student, Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius had asked him a question from the Bible: "What profit is it if you gain the whole world, but lose your own soul?" That was when Francis had given up everything to become one of the first 7 members of the Society of Jesus. And that was why he was now sailing east to India. The ship set sail in April 1541. They landed in Goa on the west coast of India in May 1542. And that was where Francis made his new headquarters. There were some Christians there already, Europeans who'd come to trade. Francis was horrified at how cruelly they treated the local people and how wickedly they lived their own lives. He began his work among these Europeans. They were mainly Portuguese, but also preached to the local people. He would walk around the streets ringing a little bell to call children to him. Then he would sit under an umbrella to guard against the sun and tell them Bible stories in their own language. Francis was always very practical. He helped people in hospital and prison. He was also a kind man, often close to tears at the suffering he saw in the crowded streets. It was no wonder he became popular with the poorest people, sharing in their troubles by eating only rice and water and by sleeping only 4 hours a day. Sometime after his arrival there, he journeyed along the coast to visit other Portuguese settlements. To his complete surprise, he found a group of Indian people who still worshiped Jesus in the way that had been used by the earliest Christians. These people were known as the Christians of St. Thomas. They believed their faith had been brought to them centuries earlier by the same Thomas who had touched Jesus after he rose from the dead. During the next few years, Francis made a trip to the Malay Peninsula and spent 4 months in a city called Malacca. While he was there, he met a Japanese man and heard stories about Japan, which no European had previously ever dared to visit. Francis returned to India determined to take the Christian message to Japan. He did this in 1549 with just 5 Christian helpers. On his arrival, he spent a year learning the language. He then started to travel around the country. He was greeted in a variety of ways. In some towns, the local ruler made him welcome. In several, he was given permission to preach. In one, he was allowed to turn a disused Buddhist temple into a church. In other places, he was less popular and was quickly turned away. Nevertheless, Francis, the first European to reach Japan, made at least 2,000 converts to Christianity before he returned to India 3 years later. His work in Japan was continued by other missionaries until 1597, when the Japanese authorities turned against them, fearing they were the beginning of a European invasion. Meanwhile, Francis decided he would next go to China. He set off with 5 other Jesuits and an interpreter. As foreigners were not then allowed into China, they landed secretly on an island called Sancian. Here, Francis developed a fever and died in early December 1552, aged just 46. St. Francis Xavier was willing to travel all over into dangerous situations with people he didn't know, just to spread the word of Jesus. Do you know people who don't know or haven't heard the word of Jesus? What might be the best way that you can share that with them?